to do honour to his host, and also to give him an exalted notion of the power and wealth of England, Clapperton assumed a dazzling costume when he paid his first visit to Sultan Bello. He covered his uniform with gold lace, donned white trousers and silk stockings, and completed this holiday attire by a Turkish turban and slippers. Bello received him, seated on a cushion in a thatched hut like an English cottage. The Sultan, a handsome man about 45 years old, wore a blue cotton tobe and a white cotton turban, one end of which fell over his nose and mouth in Turkish fashion. Bello accepted the traveller's presence with childish glee. The watch, telescope, and thermometer, which he naively called a heat watch, especially delighted him, but he wondered more at his visitor than at any of his gifts. He was unwearied in his questions as to the manners, customs, and trade of England, and after receiving several replies, he expressed a wish to open commercial relations with that power. He would like an English consul and a doctor to reside in a port he called Rocca, and finally he requested that certain articles of English manufacture should be sent to Funda, a very thriving seaport of his. After a good many talks on the different religions of Europe, Bello gave back to Clapperton the books, journals, and clothes which had been taken from Denham at the time of the unfortunate excursion in which Boukhaloum lost his life. On the 3rd May, Clapperton took leave of the Sultan. This time there was a good deal of delay before he was admitted to an audience. Bello was alone, and gave the traveller a letter for the King of England, with many expressions of friendship towards the country of his visitor, reiterating his wish to open commercial relations with it, and begging him to let him have a letter to say when the English expedition promised by Clapperton would arrive on the coast of Africa. Clapperton returned by the route by which he had come, arriving on the 8th of July at Kuka, where he rejoined Denham. He had brought with him an Arab manuscript containing a geographical and historical picture of the kingdom of Takra, governed by Mahamd Bello of Hausa, author of the manuscript. He himself had not only collected much valuable information on the geology and botany of Bornu and Hausa, but also drawn up a vocabulary of the languages of Begharmi, Mandara, Bornu, Hausa, and Timbuktu. The results of the expedition were therefore considerable. The Fellators had been heard of for the first time, and their identity with the Fans had been ascertained by Clapperton in his second journey. It had been proved that these Fellators had created a vast empire in the north and west of Africa, and also that beyond a doubt they did not belong to the Negro race. The study of their language, and its resemblance to certain idioms not of African origin, will some day throw a light on the migration of races. Lastly, Lake Tchad had been discovered, and though not entirely examined, the greater part of its shores had been explored. It had been ascertained to have 2 tributaries. The Yew, part of whose course had been traced, whilst its source had been pointed out by the natives, and the Shari, the mouth and lower portion of which had been carefully examined by Denham. With regard to the Niger, the information collected by Clapperton from the natives was still very contradictory, but the balance of evidence was in favour of its flowing into the Gulf of Benin. However, Clapperton intended, after a short rest in England, to return to Africa, and landing on the western coast make his way up the Kwara or Jaliba, as the natives call the Niger, to set at rest once for all the dispute as to whether that river was or was not identical with the Nile, to connect his new discoveries with those of Denham, and lastly to cross Africa, taking a diagonal course from Tripoli to the Gulf of Benin. Chapter 2. Clapperton's second journey, arrival at Badagry, Yariba and its capital Katanga, Bausa, attempts to get at the truth about Mungo Park's fate, Nif, Yeeyuri and Zegzeg, arrival at Kano, disappointments, death of Clapperton, return of Lander to the coast, Tukion, the Congo, Bowditch in Ashanti, Malian at the sources of the Senegal and Gambia, Major Grey, Cayley at Timbuktu, laying at the sources of the Niger, Richard and John Lander at the mouth of the Niger, Cayleyod and Letorzek in Egypt, Nubia, and the oasis of Siwa. So soon as Clapperton arrived in England, he submitted to Lord Bathurst his scheme for going to Kuka via the Bight of Benin, in other words by the shortest way, a route not attempted by his predecessors, and ascending the Niger from its mouth to Timbuktu. In this expedition 3 others were associated with Clapperton, who took the command. These 3 were a surgeon named Dixon, Pierce, a ship's captain, and Dr. Morrison, also in the merchant service, the last named well up in every branch of natural history. On the 26th November 1825 the expedition arrived in the Bight of Benin. For some reason unexplained, Dixon had asked permission to make his way to Sokatu alone, and he landed for that purpose at Wida. A Portuguese named Songa and Columbus, Denham's servant, accompanied him as far as Dahomey. 17 days after he left that town, Dixon reached Char and a little later Yeeyuri, beyond which place he was never traced. 1. One Dixon quarrelled with a native chief and was murdered by his followers. See Clapperton's Last Journey in Africa, trans. The other explorers sailed up the Bight of Benin, and were warned by an English merchant named Houtson not to attempt the ascent of the Quora, as the king of the districts watered by it had conceived an intense hatred of the English, on account of their interference with the slave trade, the most remunerative branch of his commerce. It would be much better, urged Houtson, to go to Badegry, no great distance from Sakatu, the chief of which, well disposed as he was to travellers, would doubtless give them an escort as far as the frontiers of Yariba. Houtson had lived in the country many years, and was well acquainted with the language and habits of its people. Clapperton, therefore, thought it desirable to attach him to the expedition as far as Katanga, the capital of Yariba. The expedition disembarked at Badegry on the 29th November 1825, ascended an arm of the Lagos, and then, for a distance of 2 miles, the Gazy Creek, which traverses part of Dahomey. Descending the left bank, the explorers began their march into the interior of the country, through districts consisting partly of swamps and partly of yam plantations. Everything indicated fertility. The Negroes were very averse to work, and it would be impossible to relate the numerous palavers and negotiations which had to be gone through, and the exactions which were submitted to, before porters could be obtained. The explorers succeeded, in spite of these difficulties, in reaching Jenne, 60 miles from the coast. Here Clapperton tells us he saw several looms at work, as many as 8 or 9 in one house, a regular manufactory in fact. The people of Jenne also make earthenware, but they prefer that which they get from Europe, often putting the foreign produce to uses for which it was never intended. At Jenne the travellers were all attacked with fever, the result of the great heat and the unhealthiness of the climate. Pierce and Morrison both died on the 27th December, the former soon after he left Jenne with Clapperton, the latter at that town, to which he had returned to rest. At Asando, a town of no less than 10,000 inhabitants, Dafu, containing some 5,000, and other places visited by Clapperton on his way through the country, he found that an extraordinary rumour had preceded him, to the effect that he had come to restore peace to the districts distracted by war, and to do good to the lands he explored. At Tichau the caravan met a messenger with a numerous escort, sent by the king of Yariba to meet the explorers, and shortly afterwards Katanga was entered. This town is built round the base of a rugged granite mountain. It is about 3 miles in extent, and is both framed in and planted with bushy trees, presenting a most picturesque appearance. The caravan met a messenger. Clapperton remained at Katanga from the 24th January to the 7th March, 1826. He was entertained there with great hospitality by the Sultan, who, however, refused to give him permission to go to Hausa and Bornu by way of Nif or Tapa, urging as reasons that Nif was distracted by civil war, and one of the pretenders to the throne had called in the aid of the Felatas. It would be more prudent to go through Yayayuri. Whether these excuses were true or not, Clapperton had to submit. The explorer availed himself of his detention at Katanga to make several interesting observations. This town contains no less than 7 markets, in which are exposed for sale yams, cereals, bananas, figs, the seeds of gourds, hares, poultry, sheep, lambs, linen cloth, and various implements of husbandry. The houses of the king and those of his wives are situated in 2 large parks. The doors and the pillars of the verandas are adorned with fairly well-executed carvings, representing such scenes as a boa killing an antelope, or a pig, or a group of warriors and drummers. According to Clapperton, the people of Yariba have fewer of the characteristics of the Negro race than any natives of Africa with whom he was brought in contact. Their lips are not so thick, and their noses are of a more aquiline shape. The men are well made, and carry themselves with an ease which cannot fail to be remarked. The women are less refined-looking than the men, the result probably of exposure to the sun and the fatigue they endure, compelled as they are to do all the work of the fields. Soon after leaving Katanga, Clapperton crossed the Mausa, a tributary of the Quora, and entered Kayama, one of the halting places of the caravans trading between Hausa and Borgu, and Ganja, on the frontiers of Ashanti. Kayama contains no less than 13,000 inhabitants, who are considered the greatest thieves in Africa. To say a man is from Borgu is to brand him as a blackguard at once. Outside Kayama the traveller met the Hausa caravan, some thousands of men and women, oxen, asses and horses, marching in single file, formed an interminable line presenting a singular and grotesque appearance. A motley assemblage truly, naked girls alternating with men bending beneath their loads, or with ganja merchants in the most outlandish and ridiculous costumes, mounted on bony steeds which stumbled at every step. Clapperton now made for Bowser on the Niger, where Mungo Park was drowned. Before reaching it he had to cross the Oli, a tributary of the Quora, and to pass through Wow Wow, a district of Borgu, the capital of which, also called Wow Wow, contained some 18,000 inhabitants. It was one of the cleanest and best-built towns the traveller had entered since he left Badagry. The streets are wide and well kept, and the houses are round with conical thatched roofs. Drunkenness is a prevalent vice in Wow Wow. Governor, priests, laymen, men and women indulge to excess in palm wine, in rum brought from the coast, and in boozer. The latter beverage is a mixture made of durra, honey, cayenne pepper, and the root of a coarse grass eaten by cattle, with the addition of a certain quantity of water. Clapperton tells us that the people of Wow Wow are famous for their cleanliness. They are cheerful, benevolent, and hospitable. No other people whom he had met with had been so ready to give him information about their country, and, more extraordinary still, did not meet with a single beggar. The natives say they are not aborigines of Borgu, but that they are descendants of the natives of Hausa and Nif. They speak a Yoruba dialect, but the Wow Wow women are pretty, which those of Yoruba are not. The men are muscular and well-made, but have a dissipated look. Their religion is a lax kind of Mohammedanism tinctured with paganism. Since leaving the coast, Clapperton had met tribes of unconverted fellators speaking the same language, and resembling in feature and complexion others who had adopted Mohammedanism, a significant fact which points to their belonging to one race. Bausa, which the traveller reached at last, is not a regular town, but consists of groups of scattered houses on an island of the Quora, situated in lat. 10 degrees 14 N and long, 6 degrees 11, the province of which it is the capital is the most densely populated of Borgu. The inhabitants are all pagans, even the Sultan, although his name is Mahamd. They live upon monkeys, dogs, cats, rats, beef and mutton. Breakfast was served to the Sultan whilst he was giving audience to Clapperton, whom he invited to join him. The meal consisted of a large water rat grilled without skinning, a dish of fine boiled rice, some dried fish stewed in palm oil, fried alligator's eggs, washed down with fresh water from the Quora. Clapperton took some stewed fish and rice, but was much laughed at because he would eat neither the rat nor the alligator's eggs. The Sultan received him very courteously, and told him that the Sultan of Yayayuri had had boats ready to take him to that town for the last 7 days. Clapperton replied that as the war had prevented all exit from Bornu and Yayayuri, he should prefer going by way of Kaulfo and Nif. "You are right," answered the Sultan. "You did well to come and see me, and you can take whichever route you prefer." At a later audience, Clapperton made inquiries about the Englishmen who had perished in the Quora 20 years before. This subject evidently made the Sultan feel very ill at ease, and he evaded the questions put to him by saying he was too young at the time to remember what happened. Clapperton explained that he only wanted to recover their books and papers and to visit the scene of their death, and the Sultan in reply denied having anything belonging to them, adding a warning against his guests going to the place where they died, for it was a very bad place. "But I understood," urged Clapperton, "that part of the boat they were in could still be seen." "No, it was a false report," replied the Sultan. "The boat had long since been carried down by the stream. It was somewhere amongst the rocks, he didn't know where." To a fresh demand for Park's papers and journals, the Sultan replied that he had none of them. They were in the hands of some learned men, but as Clapperton seemed to set such store by them, he would have them looked for. Thanking him for this promise, Clapperton begged permission to question the old men of the place, some of whom must have witnessed the catastrophe. No answer whatever was returned to this appeal, by which the Sultan was evidently much embarrassed. It was useless to press him further. This was a check to Clapperton's further inquiries. On every side he was met with embarrassed silence or such replies as, "The affair happened so long ago I can't remember it," or, "I was not witness to it." The place where the boat had been stopped and its crew drowned was pointed out to him, but even that was done cautiously. A few days later, Clapperton found out that the former Imam, who was a fellator, had had Mungo Park's books and papers in his possession. Unfortunately, however, this Imam had long since left Bausa. Finally, when at Kaulfo, the explorer ascertained beyond a doubt that Mungo Park had been murdered. Before leaving Borgu, Clapperton recorded his conviction of the baselessness of the bad reputation of the inhabitants, who had been branded everywhere as thieves and robbers. He had completely explored their country, travelled and hunted amongst them alone, and never had the slightest reason to complain. The traveller now endeavoured to reach Kano by way of Zwari and Zegzeg, first crossing the Quora. He soon arrived at Fabra on the Maero, the residence of the Queen Mother of Nif, and then went to visit the king, in camp at a short distance from the town. This king, Clapperton tells us, was the most insolent rogue imaginable, asking for everything he saw and quite unabashed by any refusal. His ambition and his calling in of the Fellahters, who would throw him over as soon as he had answered their purpose, had been the ruin of his country. Thanks indeed to him, nearly the whole of the industrial population of Nif had been killed, sold into slavery, or had fled the country. Clapperton was detained by illness much longer than he had intended to remain at Calfo, a commercial town on the northern banks of the Maero containing from 12 to 15,000 inhabitants. Exposed for the last 20 years to the raids of the Fellahters, Calfo had been burnt twice in 6 years. Clapperton was witness when there of the Feast of the New Moon. On that festival every one exchanged visits. The women wear their woolly hair plaited and stained with indigo. Their eyebrows are dyed the same colour. Their eyelids are painted with kohl, their lips are stained yellow, their teeth red, and their hands and feet are coloured with henna. On the day of the Feast of the Moon they don their gayest garments, with their glass beads, bracelets, copper, silver, steel or brass. They also turn the occasion to account by drinking as much boozer as the men, joining in all their songs and dances. After passing through Katanga, Clapperton entered the province of Gwari, the people of which, though conquered with the rest of Hausa by the Fellahters, had rebelled against them on the death of Bello I, and since then maintained their independence in spite of all the efforts of their invaders. Gwari, capital of the province of the same name, is situated in lat. 10 degrees 54 N and long, 8 degrees 1 E. At Fatika Clapperton entered Zegzeg, subject to the Fellahters, after which he visited Zaria, a singular-looking town laid out with plantations of millet, woods of bushy trees, vegetable gardens and sea, alternating with marshes, lawns and houses. The population was very numerous, exceeding even that of Kano, being estimated indeed at some 40 or 50,000, nearly all Fellahters. On the 19th September, after a long and weary journey, Clapperton at last entered Kano. He at once discovered that he would have been more welcome if he had come from the east, for the war with Bornu had broken off all communication with Fezzan and Tripoli. Leaving his luggage under the care of his servant Lander, Clapperton almost immediately started in quest of Sultan Bello, who they said was near Sakatu. This was an extremely arduous journey, and on it Clapperton lost his camels and horses and was compelled to put up with a miserable ox. To carry part of his baggage, he and his servants dividing the rest amongst them. Bello received Clapperton kindly and sent him camels and provisions, but as he was then engaged in subjugating the rebellious province of Gauba, he could not at once give the explorer the personal audience so important to the many interests entrusted by the English government to Clapperton. Bello advanced to the attack of Kaunia, the capital of Gauba, at the head of an army of 60,000 soldiers, 9/10 of whom were on foot and wore padded armour. The struggle was contemptible in the extreme, and this abortive attempt closed the war. Clapperton, whose health was completely broken up, managed to make his way from Sakatu to Magaria, where he saw the Sultan. After he had received the presents brought for him, Bello became less friendly. He presently pretended to have received a letter from Sheikh el-Khanami warning him against the traveller, whom his correspondent characterized as a spy, and urging him to defy the English, who meant, after finding out all about the country, to settle in it, raise up sedition and profit by the disturbances they should create to take possession of Hausa, as they had done of India. The most patent of all the motives of Bello in creating difficulties for Clapperton was his wish to appropriate the presents intended for the Sultan of Bornu. A pretext being necessary, he spread a rumour that the traveller was taking cannons and ammunition to Kuka. It was out of all reason Bello should allow a stranger to cross his dominions with a view to enabling his implacable enemy to make war upon him. Finally, Bello made an effort to induce Clapperton to read to him the letter of Lord Bathurst to the Sultan of Bornu. Clapperton told him he could take it if he liked, but that he would not give it to him, adding that everything was of course possible to him, as he had force on his side, but that he would bring dishonour upon himself by using it. "To open the letter myself," said Clapperton, "is more than my head is worth." He had come, he urged, bringing Bello a letter and presents from the King of England, relying upon the confidence inspired by the Sultan's letter of the previous year, and he hoped his host would not forfeit that confidence by tampering with another person's letter. On this the Sultan made a gesture of dismissal, and Clapperton retired. This was not, however, the last attempt of a similar kind, and things grew much worse later. A few days afterwards another messenger was sent to demand the presents reserved for Elkanami, and on Clapperton's refusing to give them up, they were taken from him. "I told the Gadado," says Clapperton, "that they were acting like robbers towards me, in defiance of all good faith, that no people in the world would act the same, and they had far better have cut my head off than done such an act. But I suppose they would do that also when they had taken everything from me." An attempt was now made to obtain his arms and ammunition, but this he resisted sturdily. His terrified servants ran away, but soon returned to share the dangers of their master, for whom they entertained the warmest affection. At this critical moment, the entries in Clapperton's journal ceased. He had now been 6 months in Sakatu, without being able to undertake any explorations, or to bring to a satisfactory conclusion the mission which had brought him from the coast. Sick at heart, weary and ill, he could take no rest, and his illness suddenly increased upon him to an alarming degree. His servant, Richard Lander, who had now joined him, tried in vain to be all things at once. On the 12th March 1827, Clapperton was seized with dysentery. Nothing could check the progress of the malady, and he sank rapidly. It being the time of the feast of the Ramadan, Lander could get no help, not even servants. Fever soon set in, and after 20 days of great suffering, Clapperton, feeling his end approaching, gave his last instructions to Lander, and died in that faithful servant's arms, on the 11th of April. "I put a large clean mat," says Lander, "over the hole and sent a messenger to Sultan Bello, to acquaint him with the mournful event, and ask his permission to bury the body after the manner of my own country, and also to know in what particular place his remains were to be interred. The messenger soon returned with the Sultan's consent to the former part of my request, and about 12 o'clock at noon of the same day, a person came into my hut, accompanied by 4 slaves, sent by Bello to dig the grave. I was desired to follow them with the corpse. Accordingly I saddled my camel, and putting the body on its back, and throwing a Union Jack over it, I bade them proceed. Travelling at a slow pace, we halted at Jungevi, a small village built on a rising ground, about 5 miles to the southeast of Sakatu. The body was then taken from the camel's back, and placed in a shed, whilst the slaves were digging the grave, which being quickly done, it was conveyed close to it. I then opened a prayer book, and, amid showers of tears, read the funeral service over the remains of my valued master. Not a single person listened to this peculiarly distressing ceremony, the slaves being at some distance, quarrelling and making a most indecent noise the whole time it lasted. This being done, the Union Jack was then taken off, and the body was slowly lowered into the earth, and I wept bitterly as I gazed for the last time upon all that remained of my generous and intrepid master. Travelling at a slow pace. Overcome by heat, fatigue, and grief, poor Lander himself now broke down, and for more than 10 days was unable to leave his hut. Bello sent several times to inquire after the unfortunate servant's health, but he was not deceived by these demonstrations of interest, for he knew they were only dictated by a wish to get possession of the traveller's baggage, which was supposed to be full of gold and silver. The Sultan's astonishment may therefore be imagined when it came out that Lander had not even money enough to defray the expenses of his journey to the coast. He never found out that the servant had taken the precaution of hiding his own gold watch, and those of Pierce and Clapperton about his person. Lander saw that he must at any cost get back to the coast as quickly as possible. By dint of the judicious distribution of a few presents, he won over some of the Sultan's advisers, who represented to their master that should Lander die he would be accused of having murdered him as well as Clapperton. Although Clapperton had advised Lander to join an Arab caravan for Fezzan, the latter, fearing that his papers and journals might be taken from him, resolved to go back to the coast. On the 3rd May Lander at last left Sakatu en route for Kano. During the first part of this journey he nearly died of thirst, but he suffered less in the second half, as the king of Jacoba who had joined him was very kind to him, and begged him to visit his country. This king told him that the Niams were his neighbours, that they had once joined him against the Sultan of Bornu, and that after the battle they had roasted and eaten the corpses of the slain. This, I believe, is the first mention, since the publication of Horniman's travels, of this cannibal race, who were to become the subjects of so many absurd fables. Lander entered Kano on the 25th May, and after a short stay there started for Funda, on the Niger, whose course he proposed following to Benin. This route had much to recommend it, being not only safe but new, so that Lander was enabled to supplement the discoveries of his master. Canfu, Carifo, Gauji and Gatas were visited in turns by Lander, who says that the people of these towns belong to the Hausa race and pay tribute to the Felatas. He also saw Dami, Dramalik and Caudonia, passed a wide river flowing towards the Quora, and visited Kartap, a huge slave and cattle market, Cauji and Dunrora, with a long chain of lofty mountains running in an easterly direction beyond. At Dunrora, just as Lander was superintending the loading of his beasts of burden, 4 horsemen, their steeds covered with foam, dashed up to the chief, and with his aid forced Lander to retrace his steps to visit the king of Zegzeg, who they said was very anxious to see him. This was by no means agreeable to Lander, who wanted to get to the Niger, from which he was not very far distant, and down it to the sea. He was, however, obliged to yield to force. His guides did not follow exactly the same route as he had taken on his way to Dunrora, and thus he had an opportunity of seeing the village of Egibai, governed by one of the chief of the warriors of the sovereign of Zegzeg. He paid his respects as required, excusing the small value of the presents he had to give on the ground of his merchandise having been stolen, and soon obtained permission to leave the place. Yeayuri, Wamba, Kalfo, Bausa, and Wauwau were the halting places on Lander's return journey to Badagry, where he arrived on the 22nd November, 1827. 2 months later he embarked for England. Although the commercial project, which had been the chief aim of Clapperton's journey, had fallen through, owing to the jealousy of the Arabs, who opposed it in their fear that the opening of a new route might ruin their trade, a good deal of scientific information had rewarded the efforts of the English explorer. In his History of Maritime and Inland Discovery, Disborough Cooley thus sums up the results obtained by the travellers whose work we have just described. The additions to our geographical knowledge of the interior of Africa, which we owe to Captain Clapperton, far exceed in extent and importance those made by any preceding traveller. The limit of Captain Lyon's journey southward across the desert was in lat. 24 degrees, while Major Denham in his expedition to Mandara reached lat. 9 degrees 15, thus adding 143 degrees or 900 miles to the extent explored by Europeans. Horniman, it is true, had previously crossed the desert, and had proceeded as far southwards as Nif in lat. 10 degrees 30, but no account was ever received of his journey. Park in his first expedition reached Silla in long 1 degrees 34 west, a distance of 1100 miles from the mouth of the Gambia. Denham and Clapperton, on the other hand, from the east side of Lake Tchad in long 17 degrees to Sakatu in long 5 degrees 30, explored a distance of 700 miles from east to west in the heart of Africa, a line of only 400 miles remaining unknown between Silla and Sakatu. The second journey of Captain Clapperton added tenfold value to these discoveries, for he had the good fortune to detect the shortest and most easy road to the populous countries of the interior, and he could boast of being the first who had completed an itinerary across the continent of Africa from Tripoli to Benin. We need add but little to so skillful and sensible a summary of the work done. The information given by Arab geographers, especially by Leo Africanus, had been verified, and much had been learnt about a large portion of the Soudan. Although the course of the Niger had not yet been actually traced, that was reserved for the expeditions of which we are now to write, it had been pretty fairly guessed at. It had been finally ascertained that the Quora or Jaliba or Niger, or whatever else the great river of northwest Africa might be called, and the Nile were totally different rivers, with totally different sources. In a word, a great step had been gained. In 1816, it was still an open question whether the Congo was not identical with the Niger. To ascertain the truth on this point, an expedition was sent out under Captain Tuckey, an English naval officer who had given proof of intelligence and courage. James Kingston Tuckey was made prisoner in 1805, and was not exchanged when he heard that an expedition was to be organized for the exploration of the Zaire. He begged to be allowed to join it, and was appointed to the command. 2 able officers and some scientific men were associated with him. Tuckey left England on the 19th March, 1816, with 2 vessels, the Congo and the Dorothea, a transport vessel under his orders. On the 20th June he cast anchor off Malembe, on the shores of the Congo in lat. 4 degrees 39, the king of that country was much annoyed when he found that the English had not come to buy slaves, and spread all manner of injurious reports against the Europeans who had come to ruin his trade. On the 18th July, Tuckey entered the vast estuary formed by the mouths of the Zaire, on board the Congo, But when the height of the river banks rendered it impossible to sail farther, he embarked with some of his people in his boats. On the 10th August he decided, on account of the rapidity of the current and the huge rocks bordering the stream, to make his way partly by land and partly by water. 10 days later the boats were brought to a final stand by an impassable fall. The explorers therefore landed and continued their journey on foot. But the difficulties increased every day, the Europeans falling ill and the Negroes refusing to carry the baggage. At last, when he was some 280 miles from the sea, Tuckey was compelled to retrace his steps. The rainy season had set in, the number of sick increased, and the commander, miserable at the lamentable result of the trip, himself succumbed to fever, and only got back to his vessel to die on the 4th October, 1816. View on the banks of the Congo. View on the banks of the Congo. Facsimile of early engraving. An exact survey of the mouth of the Congo, and the rectification of the coastline, in which there had previously been a considerable error, were the only results of this unlucky expedition. In 1807, not far from the scene of Clapperton's landing a few years later, a brave but fierce people appeared on the Gold Coast. The Ashantees, coming none knew exactly whence, flung themselves upon the Fantis, and after horrible massacres in 1811 established themselves in the whole of the country between the Kong Mountains and the sea. Ashanti warrior. Ashanti warrior. Facsimile of early engraving. As a necessary result, this led to a disturbance in the relations between the Fantis and the English, who owned some factories and counting houses on the coast. In 1816, the Ashanti king ravaged the Fanti territories in which the English had settled, reducing the latter to famine. The governor of Cape Coast Castle therefore sent a petition home for aid against the fierce and savage conqueror. The bearer of the governor's dispatches was Thomas Edward Bowditch, a young man who, actuated by a passion for travelling, had left the parental roof, thrown up his business, and having married against the wishes of his family, had finally accepted a humble post at Cape Coast Castle, where his uncle was second in command. The English minister at once acceded to the governor's request, and sent Bowditch back in command of an expedition, but the authorities at Cape Coast considered him too young for the post, and superseded him by a man whose long experience and thorough knowledge of the country and its people seemed to fit him for the important task to be accomplished. The result showed that this was an error. Bowditch was attached to the mission as scientific observer, his chief duty being to take the latitude and longitude of the different places visited. Frederick James and Bowditch left the English settlement on the 22nd August, 1817, and arrived at Kumasi, the Ashanti capital, without meeting with any other obstacle than the insubordination of the bearers, the negotiations with a view to the conclusion of a treaty of commerce, and the opening of a road between Kumasi and the coast, were brought to something of a successful issue by Bowditch, but James proved himself altogether wanting in either the power of making or enforcing suggestions. The wisdom of Bowditch's conduct was fully recognized, and James was recalled. It would seem that geographical science had little to expect from a diplomatic mission to a country already visited by Bosman, Lawyer, Desmarchis, and many others, and on which Meredith and Doutsel had written. But Bowditch turned to account his stay of 5 months at Kumasi, which is but 10 days' march from the Atlantic, to study the country, manners, customs, and institutions of one of the most interesting races of Africa. We will now briefly describe the pompous entry of the English mission into Kumasi. The whole population turned out on the occasion, and all the troops, whose numbers Bowditch estimated at 30,000 at least, were under arms. Before they were admitted to the presence of the king, the English witnessed a scene well calculated to impress upon them the cruelty and barbarity of the Ashantees. A man with his hands tied behind him, his cheeks pierced with wire, one ear cut off, the other hanging by a bit of skin, his shoulders bleeding from cuts and slashes, and a knife run through the skin above each shoulder blade, was dragged, by a cord fastened to his nose, through the town to the music of bamboos. He was on his way to be sacrificed in honor of the white men. Our observations en passant, says Bowditch, had taught us to conceive a spectacle far exceeding our original expectations, but they had not prepared us for the extent and display of the scene which here burst upon us. An area of nearly a mile in circumference was crowded with magnificence and novelty. The king, his tributaries and captains were resplendent in the distance, surrounded by attendants of every description, fronted by a mass of warriors which seemed to make our approach impervious. The sun was reflected, with a glare scarcely more supportable than the heat, from the massive gold ornaments which glistened in every direction. More than 100 bands burst at once on our arrival, into the peculiar airs of their several chiefs. The horns flourished their defiances, with the beating of innumerable drums and metal instruments, and then yielded for a while to the soft, harmonious breathings of their long flutes, with which a pleasing instrument, like a bagpipe without the drone, was happily blended. At least 100 large umbrellas or canopies, which could shelter 30 persons, were sprung up and down by the bearers with brilliant effect, being made of scarlet, yellow, and the most showy cloths and silks, and crowned on the top with crescents, pelicans, elephants, beryls, and arms, and swords of gold. The king's messengers with gold breastplates made way for us, and we commenced our round, preceded by the canes and the English flag. We stopped to take the hand of every cabossier, which, as their household suites occupied several spaces in advance, delayed us long enough to distinguish some of the ornaments in the general blaze of splendor and ostentation. The cabossiers, as did their superior captains and attendants, wore Ashanti cloths of extravagant price, from the costly foreign silks which had been unravelled to weave them, in all the varieties of colour as well as pattern. They were of an incredible size and weight, and thrown over the shoulder exactly like the Roman toga. A small silk fillet generally encircled their temples, and massy gold necklaces, intricately wrought, suspended Moorish charms, enclosed in small square cases of gold, silver, and curious embroidery. Some wore necklaces reaching to the navel, entirely of agri beads. A band of gold and beads encircled the knee, from which several strings of the same depended. Small circles of gold, like guineas, rings, and casts of animals, were strung round their ankles. Their sandals were of green, red, and delicate white leather. Manillas and rude lumps of rock gold hung from their left wrists, which were so heavily laden as to be supported on the head of one of their handsomest boys. Gold and silver pipes and canes dazzled the eye in every direction. Wolves' and rams' heads, as large as life, cast in gold, were suspended from their gold-handled swords, which were held around them in great numbers. The blades were shaped like round bills and rusted in blood. The sheaths were of leopard skin or the shell of a fish like shagreen. The large drums, supported on the head of one man and beaten by 2 others, were braced around with the thigh bones of their enemies and ornamented with their skulls. The kettle drums, resting on the ground, were scraped with wet fingers and covered with leopard skin. The wrists of the drummers were hung with bells and curiously shaped pieces of iron, which jingled loudly as they were beating. The smaller drums were suspended from the neck by scarves of red cloth. The horns, the teeth of young elephants, were ornamented at the mouthpiece with gold, and the jaw bones of human victims. The war caps of eagles' feathers nodded in the rear, and large fans of the wing feathers of the ostrich played around the dignitaries. Immediately behind their chairs, which were of a black wood, almost covered by inlays of ivory and gold embossment, stood their handsomest youths, with corselets of leopard skin, covered with gold cockle shells and stuck full of small knives, sheathed gold and silver, and the handles of blue agate. Cartouch boxes of elephants' hide hung below, ornamented in the same manner. A large gold-handled sword was fixed behind the left shoulder, and silk scarves and horses' tails, generally white, streamed from the arms and waist cloth. Their long Danish muskets had broad rims of gold at small distances, and the stocks were ornamented with shells. Finely grown girls stood behind the chairs of some, with silver basins. Their stools, of the most laborious carved work, and generally with 2 large bells attached to them, were conspicuously placed on the heads of favourites, and crowds of small boys were seated around, flourishing elephants' tails curiously mounted. The warriors sat on the ground close to these, and so thickly as not to admit of our passing without treading on their feet, to which they were perfectly indifferent. Their caps were of the skin of the pangolin and leopard, the tails hanging down behind, their cartouch belts, composed of small gourds which hold the charges, and covered with leopard's or pig's skin, were embossed with red shells, and small brass bells thickly hung to them. On their hips and shoulders was a cluster of knives. Iron chains and collars dignified the most daring, who were prouder of them than of gold. Their muskets had rests affixed of leopard's skin, and the locks a covering of the same. The sides of their faces were curiously painted in long white streaks, and their arms also striped, having the appearance of armour. We were suddenly surprised by the sight of Moors, who afforded the first general diversity of dress. There were 17 superiors, arrayed in large cloaks of white satin, richly trimmed with spangled embroidery. Their shirts and trousers were of silk, and a very large turban of white muslin was studded with a border of different coloured stones. Their attendants wore red caps and turbans, and long white shirts which hung over their trousers. Those of the inferiors were of dark blue cloth. They slowly raised their eyes from the ground as we passed, and with a most malignant scowl. The prolonged flourishes of the horns, a deafening tumult of drums, and the fuller concert at the intervals, announced that we were approaching the king. We were already passing the principal officers of his household: the chamberlain, the gold horn blower, the captain of the messengers, the captain for royal executions, the captain of the market, the keeper of the royal burying ground, and the master of the bands, sat surrounded by a retinue and splendour which bespoke the dignity and importance of their offices. The cook had a number of small services, covered with leopard skin, held behind him, and a large quantity of massy silver plate was displayed before him: punch bowls, waiters, coffee pots, tankards, and a very large vessel with heavy handles and clawed feet, which seemed to have been made to hold incense. I observed a Portuguese inscription on one piece, and they seemed generally of that manufacture. The executioner, a man of immense size, wore a massy gold hatchet on his breast, and the execution stool was held before him, clotted in blood and partly covered with a caul of fat. The king's 4 linguists were encircled by a splendour inferior to none, and their peculiar insignia, gold canes, were elevated in all directions, tied in bundles like fasces. The keeper of the treasury added to his own magnificence by the ostentatious display of his service. The blow pan, boxes, scales, and weights were of solid gold. A delay of some minutes whilst we severally approached to receive the king's hand afforded us a thorough view of him. His deportment first excited my attention. Native dignity in princes we are pleased to call barbarous was a curious spectacle. His manners were majestic, yet courteous, and he did not allow his surprise to beguile him for a moment of the composure of the monarch. He appeared to be about 38 years of age, inclined to corpulence, and of a benevolent countenance. This account is followed by a description, extending over several pages, of the costume of the king, the filing past of the chiefs and troops, the dispersing of the crowd, and the ceremonies of reception, which lasted far on into the night. Reading Bowditch's extraordinary narrative, we are tempted to ask if it be not the outcome of the traveller's imagination, for we can scarcely credit what he says of the wonderful luxury of this barbarous court, the sacrifice of thousands of persons at certain seasons of the year, the curious customs of this warlike and cruel people, this mixture of barbarism and civilization hitherto unknown in Africa. We could not acquit Bowditch of great exaggeration, had not later travellers as well as contemporary explorers confirmed his statements. We can therefore only express our astonishment that such a government, founded on terror alone, could have endured so long. It is a pleasure to us Frenchmen when we can quote the name of a fellow countryman amongst the many travellers who have risked their lives in the cause of geographical science. Without abating our critical acumen, we feel our pulse quicken when we read of the dangers and struggles of such travellers as Malien, Cayley, de Cayley-Odd, and Letorzec. Gaspar Malien was nephew to Napoleon's Minister of the Treasury. He was on board the Medusa, but was fortunate enough to escape when that vessel was shipwrecked, and to reach the coast of the Sahara in a boat, whence he made his way to Senegal. The dangers from which Malien had just escaped would have destroyed the love of adventure and exploration in a less ardent spirit. They had no such effect upon him. He left St. Louis as soon as ever he obtained the assent of the governor, Fleuriau, to his proposal to explore the sources of the great rivers of Senegambia, and especially those of the Djeliba. Malien started from Jeddah on the 29th January, 1818, and taking an easterly course between the 15th and 9th parallels of north latitude, crossed the kingdom of Domel, and entered the districts peopled by the Yaloufs. Unable to go by way of Woolly, he decided in favour of the Fouta Toro route, and in spite of the jealousy of the natives and their love of pillage, he reached Bandu without accident. It took him 3 days to traverse the desert between Bandu and the districts beyond the Gambia, after which he penetrated into Niokolo, a mountainous country, inhabited by the all but wild Pules and Jalans. Leaving Bandea, Malien entered Fouta Jalan, and reached the sources of the Gambia and the Rio Grande, which are in close proximity. A few days later he came to those of the Falim, and in spite of the repugnance and fear of his guide, he made his way into Timbo, the capital of Fouta. The absence of the king and most of the inhabitants probably spared him from a long captivity abbreviated only by torture. Fouta is a fortified town. The king owns houses, with mud walls between 3 and 4 feet thick and 15 high. At a short distance from Timbo, Malien discovered the sources of the Senegal, at least what were pointed out to him as such by the blacks, but it was impossible for him to take astronomical observations.